why are we talking about the theory of evolution? And the simple answer is that this is a pervasive doctrine across virtually the whole world. You pick up a high school biology book, you pick up scientific research papers, and you'll find the majority of scientists and educators are in fact assuming that the theory of evolution is a fact. And this has become so pervasive in society today that if you actually challenge the theory of evolution, you are looked down upon by the scientific community. So we want to, I guess, this afternoon, talk a little bit about some of the theory behind this particular approach. We want to look at some of the gaps which scientists are unable to really provide answers for, and hopefully to be able to stir your conscience to be able to look at an alternative. And we're going to show at the conclusion of our seminar today there is an alternative, a much more viable alternative than the pervasive sense of evolution. So the question we ask, does evolution have the real answers to the origin of life? And we believe as Christadelphians, as Bible students, that the answer to that question is no, it doesn't have real answers. Let's just define our terms before we start. Now, what is evolution? Well, evolution is the change in the inherited characteristics of biological populations over successive generations. Well, it has to be inherited. You have to be able to pass this change on to your children. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So evolution involves the change in inherited characteristics. What's in your DNA, what you pass on to your children is what evolution is looking at. And as far as evolution is concerned, there are really two classes which promote the change of evolutionary theory. The first is what they call microevolution. Well, 30, 40 years ago, we used the expression variation within a species. For example, I might have blue eyes, my wife might have green eyes. Different color hair, different color shape, all these kind of things. Microevolution is not really the issue that we're talking about today. We believe that there is variation in the species. We all look different. Well, animals look different, but they're still animals, we're still humans. But as far as evolution is concerned, they go the next stage up, what they call macroevolution. And this is not just change, this is change and adaptation from one species to another, from molecule to man. And that theory demands, as we're going to see, enormous changes. In addition to that, there are two main drivers for this macroevolution, this change of species. The first is DNA mutations. So these are changes at the DNA level. And it's essential to the theory of evolution that these changes occur at this level to be able to pass on to successive generations. And the second driving force is natural selection. So you might inherit characteristics, and those characteristics are then, if you like, manipulated by the environment that you're in. And so that change is then permanently in your DNA, which then goes to the next generation, and so on. So those are two driving forces, DNA and natural selection. Well, there's a great challenge to the theory of evolution, and it has to do with this idea of inheriting characteristics and qualities from generation to generation. Now, we're not talking about small changes, as I mentioned before, color of the eyes, color of the hair, shape of the body, things like that. We're not talking about that. The changes required for evolution to work are radical changes. You know, as we have there on the screen, some organism has to learn how to convert sugars to energy. Another has to convert sunlight into sugars. Another has to take light and make sure that it has receptors to be able to accept the light and also to process that light in the brain. Now, these are massive changes. This is not just tweaking eye color. These are radical changes which are required. As we have there, they're not simple steps. And we find, in fact, that to get from molecule to man, there are multiple steps, multiple functions. And sometimes these functions are all necessary because they're circular. What I change here, I have to change there. So it's not just a simple movement from A to B. These are radical, complex changes that are required. Now, at the moment, mutation, which is one of the driving forces of evolutionary theory, requires changes to the genetic code. What we find is that if you look at the DNA model, it's made up of A, B, C, and Ds, which scientists put together on this magnificent helix. And what we find is that mutations change a letter here or there. But what we really are looking for is not just changes in existing systems. We're looking for something to add to the chain. And evolution, mutation cannot do that. To make evolution happen, we need like a genetic scriptwriter, as some author said. Well, we need to be able to actually write new DNA, not take away existing DNA, but to write new DNA. And there is no known example of any mutation that an evolutionary theorist can give you of an example when new DNA is created from nothing. It will only change existing information. It will not generate new information. And that's a huge challenge to the theory of evolution. There is no example of mutation that adds information. It just corrupts existing stuff. Now, in the last few weeks, I've looked at a few documentaries on evolution. And what is missing from the documentaries is the origin of life itself. So we're talking about before life even exists, when there is nothing. Just blackness, just empty space, no time, nothing. And evolution has absolutely no answer for that at all. In fact, what's annoying about these evolutionary documentaries is they all start with known elements like hydrogen, oxygen, helium, which combine. Now, where did all that come from? Where did the helium come from? The oxygen come from? And they have no answer to that. Now we're going to probe that question a bit further. I want you to imagine nothing. It's that. If you close your eyes, it's just black. That is exactly the origin of life, isn't it? Nothing. This is what evolution is saying. Nothing. Absolutely black, absolutely empty, no energy, no matter, nothing. And then, for no reason at all, says the evolutionist, trillions and trillions of tons of matter, this is a significant amount of matter, and extensive amounts of energy suddenly, all of a sudden, appear to make themselves and then stop making themselves. A one-off event. Now, how did that happen? How can you possibly explain that? From absolutely nothing to suddenly trillions of tons of matter and enormous amounts of energy suddenly appear. Where did that come from? It just doesn't make any scientific or logical sense. Because it comes into immediate conflict with the First Law of Thermodynamics. Now, for those of you who remember your physics back in high school, let's just remind you what the Law of Thermodynamics is all about. In our universe, says the law, the levels of both mass and energy are fixed. There's a total level that cannot be increased or decreased. You can convert mass to energy and you can convert energy to mass, but it's not possible to reduce or increase the total of both of them. So immediately, this idea of explosions and matter, trillions of tons of matter, coming from nowhere, contradicts known scientific laws. If the total amount of energy and matter in the universe remains constant, we are immediately in conflict with known scientific ideas. So immediately we have a problem. I don't. The evolutionists have a problem. The conclusion is that the accidental appearance of matter and energy from nothing cannot be explained by any scientific observation and is contrary to scientific reasoning. It just doesn't work scientifically or logically. So, from the evolutionist point of view, what is the story? Well, at some unknown time, all of this material, trillions and trillions and trillions of tons of material, is all of a sudden compressing itself and compressing itself and compressing itself into just a pinhead of material. And when it gets to that point of time, the compression is so intense that bang! From nothing comes this explosion of matter and energy. The Big Bang is accepted by most scientists today as a rational explanation for the origin of life. But we find, in fact, that has been challenged. In May 2004, in the prestigious magazine New Scientist, there was an open letter to the scientific community signed by 35 astrophysicists and physicists affirming that the Big Bang theory had not been proven. Its predictions were contradicted by astronomical evidence. Now, this is taught as fact in biology books, to university students, to the world in general. And yet we have here a little known fact that scientifically there are scientists who actually say it's not logical for that to happen. Not logical at all. Evolutionary theory claims that 13.8 billion years ago, very precise, 13.8 billion years ago, the entire universe was inside a bubble. It was thousands of times smaller than a pinhead. It was hotter and denser than anything we could imagine, and that just exploded in every direction. From there, as this massive amount of energy is beginning to cool, we get supernovas. And in actual fact, these supernovas consisted of what we call atomless matter, because atoms come later. Now, how can you get matter without atoms? It's not explained by scientists. So as the universe is cooling down, then atoms suddenly come together, and then the atomless matter disappears. That's very convenient when you think about it. No one's ever discovered or can prove atomless matter. And when the atoms come together, the atomless matter disappears. That's very convenient, isn't it? Highly convenient. And we find, in fact, that what evolutionary theory cannot address is where is the scientific evidence for this matter made up of whatever, but not atoms. It's just not there. Secondly, they say that once the universe starts to cool down, quarks, protons, neutrons, electrons suddenly begin to come together. Now, where do these things come from? Well, these are electrical charges, subatomic material. Well, highly complex, well, coming together suddenly. Well, and what brings them together? There's no known scientific force to do that. And how did all energy come into a pinhead and then explode? And how, if this is exploding in vast amounts of space, could all of a sudden something come back together to create atoms? You see, logically, it doesn't make any sense. How did the matter compress when there is no scientific explanation for it to compress itself? We have a bang pushing it out. Why suddenly do we bring it back in again? You see, there are inconsistencies on every side. And that's why those scientists got together and said that you cannot actually support the Big Bang theory. It doesn't make any sense. Our own solar system, astronomers say, came out of condensed matter. So as this stuff is exploding across the universe, it's beginning to collect in clouds. And finally, those condense and begin to become denser and denser, and that then packs them together, and then they form perfectly round spheres. But we've got some problems with that. The first one is this. It fails to explain scientifically how elements can group themselves together in such a high concentration when the Big Bang is pushing everything out. What's suddenly making these things condense? No scientific explanation. It fails to explain how hydrogen molecules, which have less mass and less gravitational force, are pulled into the center when the heavier elements are not. Now, a heavier element has more mass, has more gravitational attraction, and therefore should come to the center before the less elements like hydrogen. Yeah, we have it the other way around. We've got hydrogen and helium coming in to create things first, and the denser atoms on the outside. That is contrary to gravitational physics. And it fails to explain why all the planets are rotating one way, except for one planet, Venus, that's going the other way. Now, you think that with things exploding and expanding and then condensing, that there will be a certain rhythm to all of that. But one planet actually is going the opposite way. And in fact, the moons of Jupiter are in all directions, which again is contrary to physics and also to astronomical observations. And then we come to our wonderful planet, planet Earth. So all the elements of the Earth, chemicals, gases, water, atmosphere, suddenly self-created without reason. You see, evolution is blind. Why on earth do we have this magnificent planet which is able to support life? Did it just happen? Is there a reason behind that? Well, we just got this magnificent planet ready for no reason. It doesn't make sense at all. And the first forms of life, according to evolutionary theorists, the single bacterial cell, begin to make themselves chemicals and fluid. They begin to move within the fluid, and they begin to divide. And these very simple cells are the building block of matter. And that sounds all very rational, reasonable. Let me tell you about the simple cell. It is not a simple cell. And that diagram there on the screen is indicative of the complexity of the simple single cell. Well, I'm going to show you a video clip which gives you a little idea of one part of that cell and the way it works. It is quite amazing. So hopefully we're going to get this sound going and see how we go.
These are tiny molecular machines, and they're doing this inside your body right now. To understand why, we have to zoom out. Every day in an adult human body, 50 to 70 billion of your cells die. Either they're stressed or damaged or just old. But this is normal. In fact, it's called programmed cell death. But to make up for all these lost cells, right now, billions of your cells are dividing, essentially creating new cells. And that process of cell division, also called mitosis, well, it requires an army of tiny molecular machines. So let's take a closer look. DNA is a good place to start, the double helix molecule we always talk about. This is a scientifically accurate depiction of DNA created by Drew Barry at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research. If you unwind the two strands, you can see that each has a sugar phosphate backbone connected to the sequence of nucleic acid base pairs, known by the letters A, T, G, and C. Now, the strands run in opposite directions, which is important when you go to copy DNA. Copying DNA is one of the first steps in cell division. Here, the two strands of DNA are being unwound and separated by the tiny blue molecular machine called helicase. Helicase literally spins as fast as a jet engine. The strand of DNA on the right has its complementary strand assembled continuously, but the other strand is more complicated because it runs in the opposite direction. So it must be looped out with its complementary strand assembled in reverse, section by section. At the end of this process, you have two identical DNA molecules, each one a few centimeters long, but just a couple nanometers wide. So to prevent the DNA from becoming a tangled mess, it is wrapped around proteins called histones, forming a nucleosome. These nucleosomes are bundled together into a fiber known as chromatin, which is further looped and coiled to form a chromosome, one of the largest molecular structures in your body. You can actually see chromosomes under a microscope in dividing cells. Only then do they take on their characteristic shape. Otherwise, the DNA is more strewn inside the nucleus. The process of dividing a cell takes around an hour in mammals, so this footage is from a time lapse. You can see how the chromosomes line up on the equator of the cell. Now, when everything is right, they are pulled apart into the two new daughter cells, each one containing an identical copy of DNA. Now, simple as this looks, the process is incredibly complicated and requires even more fascinating molecular machines to accomplish it.
Complicated.
So let's look at a single chromosome. One chromosome consists of two sausage-shaped chromatids containing the identical copies of DNA made earlier. Each chromatid is attached to microtubule fibers, which guide and help align them in the correct position. The microtubules are connected to the chromatid at the kinetochore, here colored red. The kinetochore consists of hundreds of different proteins working together to achieve multiple objectives. In fact, it's one of the most sophisticated molecular mechanisms inside your body. The kinetochore is central to the successful separation of the chromatids. It creates a dynamic connection between the chromosome and the microtubules. For a reason no one's yet been able to figure out, the microtubules are constantly being built at one end and deconstructed at the other. While the chromosome is still getting ready, the kinetochore sends out a chemical stop signal to the rest of the cell, shown here by the red molecules, basically saying this chromosome is not yet ready to divide. The kinetochore also mechanically senses tension. When the tension is just right and the position and attachment are correct, all the proteins get ready, shown here by turning green. At this point, the stop signal broadcasting system is not switched off. Instead, it is literally carried away from the kinetochore down the microtubules by a dynein motor. That's the walking guy. This is really what it looks like. It has long legs so it can avoid obstacles and step over the kinesins, molecular motors that walk in the opposite direction. Personally, I'm astounded by these tiny molecular machines, how they're able to routinely and faithfully execute their functions billions of times over inside your body at this exact instant. I'm also amazed by the scientists who were able to work out how this happens in such detail that we could create realistic depictions of them, like you saw in the animations in this video. But perhaps the most amazing thing is just how much is left to be discovered, like figuring out how exactly the chromatids are pulled to opposite ends of the cell. There is still so much that we don't quite know. You know, what I find exciting is that in science fiction, for decades, we've been writing about tiny nanobots that will be injected into our bloodstreams that can heal us. But what this suggests, the existence of these tiny molecular machines inside us, it suggests that there isn't a physical limit that would prevent that. And so I think it's pretty likely that in future, we will be able to develop our own tiny molecular machines that will be able to repair our bodies better than they can repair themselves.
Now, that clip just demonstrates several things. It firstly demonstrates just one part, one fraction of that cell, the mitochondria, which involves the replication of DNA, the division of cells. Now, I was impressed when I looked at that, of these tiny molecular machines that walk up and down in such a remarkable way. So a simple single cell is not simple at all. It is highly complex, and you heard that word several times in that presentation. Now, we are expected to believe that all of those functions arose by chance, without reason, through mutation and change. We're going to see, in fact, the mathematical probability of that is almost zero. Think about origin of life is, and scientists have tried to recreate this in a chemical soup, is that it's not just chemistry coming together. It's not just putting together molecules and atoms and so on. It's information. And researchers have attempted to calculate what is the bare minimum of information I need to make the simplest cell. And they came down to the fact that the genome must consist of 387 protein codes and 3 RNA coding genes, and they are exceedingly complex. In fact, the New Scientist magazine said that when we looked at trying to theoretically put together the minimum requirements for life, the end of this, they said, in short, we find, in fact, that we really need what's now called the modern cell. We can't do away with a lot of these particular intricate mechanisms. There has been no origin of life simulation that approaches this minimum in the slightest. The scientists have managed to be able to create some type of organism based upon the fact of using organisms. They have not created life from nothing. Now, let's look at the mathematics of this occurring, the probability of this occurring. Natural selection cannot operate without a self-sustaining reproducing system. If I have life, it has to reproduce. If it has to reproduce, it has to have the mechanism to reproduce. It has to have the mechanism to feed, to live, to move, to reproduce. These are all complex things. In fact, the famous cosmologist, Sir Fred Hoyle, said this, and he was once an atheist and he changed his mind. The likelihood of the formation of life from inanimate matter is 1 to a number with 40,000 noughts. It is big enough to bury Darwin and the whole theory of evolution. There was no primeval soup, neither on this planet nor any other. And if the beginnings of life were not random, they must therefore have been the product of purposeful intelligence. And here's a scientist, highly recommended, Sir Fred Hoyle, astronomist, once an atheist. When he looked at all of the mathematical probabilities, arrived at the conclusion there is no such thing as this evolution of life from a primordial soup. So let's just look at the maths. Now here is the ear, okay, complex. And we're just going to take 10 elements of this ear. From the outer ear, middle ear, and inner ear, just 10 of them. And we're going to look at the probability of all of these being able to mold themselves into the right shape in the right place. So firstly, let's assume that the probability of one of these components forming perfectly is 1 in 10,000. That's very, very generous. So let's just take, for example, the little anvil that's in your ear, tiny little piece. It's called an anvil because it's very similar shape to an anvil. It's a hammer, actually, that hits that, and the vibrations are then interpreted by the brain. Now, this is just one small piece of componentry. So let's say evolution is working. Let's say, for example, that we have some type of bone growth around roughly the shape of an anvil and it's passed on from generation to generation. The chance of that happening are very generous, 1 in 10,000. To get 10 components together, all working perfectly, all the right shape, we then multiply that by 10, don't we? And there we have 1 followed by 40 zeros. And then we have to have them all in the right order. It's no good having the outer ear here, and the inner ear on the outer side, and vice versa. They all have to be in the right order so the sound can go through. And it presupposes that the ear knows what sound is. So we then change the probability and make it increased, and we have trillions and trillions of zeros. And that's just 10 parts of the ear. Now, that's just mathematical probability. In other words, it's almost impossible from a mathematical perspective, probability perspective, for that to happen. To get 1 part and then 10 parts, and we have an ear with 60, 70, 80 parts. It's just, and that's just the ear, it is impossible to happen. Now, evolution also cannot explain the male-female reproduction cycle. Now, you think about this, evolutionists say, well, in the beginning we had microbes and they just divided. It was asexual reproduction. Now, how do you get from asexual reproduction, of microbes just dividing, to the complexities of male and female reproductive organs that work perfectly. Evolution has no answer for that. You see, that the problem is that whilst you're evolving your ovaries, you can't reproduce. And therefore, the next generations obviously cannot be affected because you can't reproduce. You have to have perfectly working reproductive organs from the very start to be able to reproduce. Evolution has no answer for that. The fossil records. So here is the geological evidence, which is actually presented. And over the thousands and thousands of fossils that have been found, there has not been one real transitional fossil. In other words, a half-evolved elephant or a half-evolved frog. The fossil record does not support the case for natural selection. Here is an extract from a geologist. No fossil or other physical evidence directly connects man to ape. The problem for gradualists, as those who support Darwin, is that these ancestral species remain essentially unchanged throughout their million-year lifespans. Now that think about that, the fossils they dig up look like perfectly formed animals, perfectly formed creatures. In addition to the lack of a missing link to explain the relatively sudden appearance of modern man, gradualists cannot easily explain the mysterious Cambrian Explosion 600 million years ago. This was an evolutionary leap that transformed the Earth from a mess of simple microscopic bacteria and blue-green algae to a planet bursting at the seams with primitive representatives of every type of multicellular plant and invertebrate animal, from the lowly protozoans to such complex creatures as trilobites. So what it's saying is that the evidence of the fossil record is suddenly life explodes and it's all fully formed creatures. How does evolution explain that? We find also, in fact, that one of the mechanisms for evolution, which is mutation, actually affecting the laws of genetics, unfortunately, the majority of mutations are harmful to the species. And I think as human beings, we see mutations around us. We see deformities. We see things that don't go right. We don't see a new species. And there, that tragic photograph of a child having additional digits. And we know the stress that mutations and disabilities cause. We don't see the scientific evidence for improvement, but rather we see the opposite. And the other thing, too, that evolution is really incapable of explaining the uniqueness of the Earth in supporting life itself. In the year 2000, a couple of evolutionary scientists put together a book called Why Complex Life is Uncommon in the Universe. This was an interesting book because, you see, mankind spends millions of dollars sending out signals looking for extra intelligence across the universe. And this book came out saying, well, actually, the planet we're on is indeed rare. And to support complex life, you need circumstances which only our planet can give. So they went through the whole system of the Earth and its environment. It's the right position in the galaxy. It's not near the center where there is dangerous supernova activity and dangerous radiation. We're on the edges of the galaxy. The planet has the right mass. The sun has the right mass. If it was bigger, there'd be too much ultraviolet radiation, we'd be cooked. It's the right distance from the sun. Temperature is suitable for life. The solar system is a stable planetary orbiting system. There's not chaos out there. Jupiter itself is like a huge magnet. There's gravitational attraction, and it clears out comets and asteroids which take them away from the planet Earth. Earth has a large supply of liquid water near the planet's surface. Quite unique. The salinity and pH of the water is just right. The atmosphere is just right, just the right pressure. The atmosphere just doesn't disappear off into space. It's held together in a wonderful sense of gravitational attraction. The right amount of carbon to sustain life, the right tilt in the seasons. And the book went through all of these kind of things, explaining that the Earth is just right. Now, is all that chance? Is all that through some evolutionary, unreasoning chance? We would suggest no. And then evolution is able to explain what we call symbiotic relationships. That is the dependency of one species on another. And the classic example here is the yucca plant, unusual name, and the pronuba moth. Now, the yucca plant is in the Americas. And the fascinating thing is that there's probably about 12 or so yucca species across the Americas. And they are only fertilized by the pronuba moth. In fact, so special is the fertilization that the pronuba moth for one species cannot, in fact, fertilize another species of yucca plant. That's how stringent these reproduction cycles are. Now, what happens is this. Is that the yucca moth, the yucca plant only grows and develops flowers once a year. At the same time, there just happens to be the hatching of this pronuba moth. And the pronuba moth then goes to the yucca plant, no other plant, got a special little tool, chisels a little hole in the stamen of the yucca plant, deposits its eggs in there, fertilizes, takes some pollen, goes to the next yucca plant, cross-fertilizes it, deposits its eggs, and so on. No other animal will do that, only this particular moth. When the eggs develop, the larvae within the yucca plant only need about 30% of the seeds to feed on, leaving 2/3 of the seeds ready for reproduction for the next yucca plant cycle. Now, that's an amazing thing, and there are many examples of this symbiotic relationship. Now, here is the difficulty with evolution. Moths, according to the evolutionary schedule, evolved 200 million years ago, but the yucca plant only developed 80 million years ago. Now, we've got a problem here. Because you've got these pronuba moths 200 million years ago, and they've got no way of reproducing or feeding or existing because they have to wait another couple of 100 million years until the yucca plant is evolved. That makes no sense at all. And there are dozens and dozens of examples of that symbiotic relationship where, according to the evolutionary scale, the animal being created or evolved and the plant being evolved across millions of years gap, they would not exist unless they were together. There's a concept in life which we have now termed the concept of irreducible complexity. Take a mousetrap, for example. It has maybe 4 or 5 working components. It has a platform, has a trap, has a spring, has a lever there which holds the trap, and you have a place there for the cheese or for the bait, and have a little swivel so that when the animal hits the plate, tries to take the cheese, the trap shuts. If you remove any of those 4 or 5 elements, the trap does not work. It's called irreducible complexity. You need all of those 4 or 5 elements to make the trap a trap, otherwise it won't work. Now, that's precisely the same with our biological world. Now, we haven't got time this afternoon to talk about this in detail. Some bacteria have a little outboard motor on the back. It's called a flagellum. This flagellum is a little whip-like action that actually propels the bacteria through the medium. And when scientists delved deeper into this through the electron microscope, they discovered, to their amazement, that there's a little engine, a little biological engine that makes this thing flip around. And there's a picture there on the screen there. And it's at the molecular level and is driven by the movement of subatomic particles and ions moving from one pressure point to another pressure plate that turns it around. Now, the point is this. That little motor has biological bearings, it has biological gears, it has biological propellers, if you like. And all of those things are absolutely necessary for the thing to work. You take away any of those things and it won't work. Now, once again, the probability of getting that right at the subatomic level is impossible. There's a little gear system, a micro machine that pushes this thing along in various media. And this thing, apparently, goes at the speed of a jet engine. It can turn and twist at any angle. There's no wearing of the bearings. There's no oil needed to keep it going. And it thrashes around wherever this thing wants to go. It is a remarkable thing. You can go onto the internet and look at these little models working. It's really quite an amazing thing. The Bacterial Flagellum. There's another one. Blood clotting. If we as humans are still evolving and we happen to cut ourselves and the blood clotting mechanism is not there, we're going to bleed to death. The thing about this is that the blood clotting anticipates cuts and damage to the skin. Now that's design. You see, evolutionary is unreasoning, has no purpose. Why possibly would an evolutionary body decide for no reason to stop the blood flowing? There's design here. So there's anticipation, something which evolution, of course, knows nothing about. Unless this blood clotting occurred from the very beginning, humans would bleed out. And we always cut ourselves, don't we? We would bleed out. So here is this irreducible complexity. And the complexity of getting this fibrinogen into the system to actually heal the cut is an incredibly complex kind of thing, dependent upon 100 different processes of proteins and molecules all coming together, signals in which the body says there is a problem with the finger, and to send these across the bloodstream to solve the problem in the finger. Evolution has no answer. And that really brings us to, I think, some of the complexity of life around us. That is, the odds are impossible for this to happen. You take photosynthesis. This is the mechanism by which sunlight is absorbed by leaves to generate sugars to make the plant grow. And you only have to look at the diagrams that scientists put together to show the tremendous sense of complexity. The membrane of the leaf has little valves, stomata, which allow light to come in, carbon dioxide to come in, oxygen to go out. If that wasn't working from the very beginning, we'd have no life in the planet. Absorb carbon dioxide, produce oxygen. What an amazing system that is. And the diagrams in which the membrane of the cells allows certain material in through certain locks and keys is absolutely fascinating to watch in these molecular models. I'm going to show you another little video clip.
You breathe in about 17,000 times per day. It's a process you rarely think about, but behind the scenes, a huge coordinated effort is playing out. Your vital organs, the gut, brain, bones, lungs, blood, and heart, work together to sustain your life by delivering oxygen to tissues throughout your body. Most of our cells need oxygen because it's one of the key ingredients of aerobic respiration. That's the process that produces a molecule called ATP, which our cells use to power their many incredible functions. But getting oxygen throughout our bodies is a surprisingly difficult task. Gas enters cells by diffusing in from their surroundings, and that only happens efficiently over tiny distances. So, for oxygen to reach the cells within our bodies, it needs a transportation network. This is where our 20 trillion red blood cells come in. Each one contains about 270 million oxygen-binding molecules of hemoglobin, which is what gives blood its scarlet hue. To make these cells, the body uses raw materials that become available from the food we eat. So in some ways, you could say that oxygen's journey through the body really begins in the gut. Here, in an amazing display of mechanical and chemical digestion, food gets broken down into its smallest elements, like iron, the building block of hemoglobin. Iron is carried through the cardiovascular system to the body's hematopoietic tissue. This tissue is the birthplace of red blood cells, and it can be found enclosed within our bone marrow cavities. The kidneys regulate our levels of red blood cells through the release of erythropoietin, a hormone which causes marrow to increase production. Our bodies churn out roughly 2.5 million red blood cells per second, a number equivalent to the entire population of Paris, so that oxygen that makes it to the lungs will have ample transportation. But before oxygen can even reach the lungs, the brain needs to get involved. The brainstem initiates breathing by sending a message through your nervous system, all the way to muscles of the diaphragm and ribs. This causes them to contract, thus increasing the space inside the ribcage, which allows the lungs to expand. That expansion drops your lungs' internal air pressure, making air rush in. It's tempting to think of our lungs as two big balloons, but they're actually a lot more complicated than that. Here's why. The red blood cells in the vessels within your lungs can only pick up oxygen molecules that are very close to them. Here's why. If our lungs were shaped like balloons, air that was not in direct contact with the balloon's inner surface couldn't diffuse through. Here's why. Our lungs' architecture ensures that very little oxygen is wasted. Their interior is divided into hundreds of millions of miniature balloon-like projections called alveoli that dramatically increase the contact area to somewhere around 100 square meters. The alveolar walls are made of extremely thin, flat cells that are surrounded by capillaries. Together, the alveolar wall and capillaries make a 2-cell thick membrane that brings blood and oxygen close enough for diffusion. These oxygen-enriched cells are then carried from the lungs through the cardiovascular network, a massive collection of blood vessels that reaches every cell in the body. If we laid this system out end to end in a straight line, the vessels would wrap around the Earth several times. Propelling red blood cells through this extensive network requires a pretty powerful pump, and that's where your heart comes in. The human heart pumps an average of about 100,000 times per day, and it's the powerhouse that ultimately gets oxygen where it needs to go, completing the body's team effort. Just think, this entire complex system is built around the delivery of tiny molecules of oxygen. If just one part malfunctioned, so would we. Breathe in. Your gut, brain, bones, lungs, blood, and heart are continuing their incredible act of coordination that keeps you alive. Breathe out.
That little clip demonstrates that, in actual fact, it's not just necessary to evolve lungs. You need that to work with the heart, the brain, the bones. So imagine the mathematical probability of getting all that to work from nothing. It is impossible. And if it's not working together, it's not working. And if it's not working, there's no life. And if there's no life, you can't pass it on to your children. So you see the very complexity of all of this really defeats the theory of evolution. Is there an alternative? And we believe there is. And the alternative is a designed and planned special creation. As the opening words of the Bible so eloquently put it, in the beginning, God created. And this makes much more sense. Spontaneous, special, designed, planned creation, everything working together makes much more sense than the bankruptcy of evolution. If you've got your Bibles there, I'd like you to turn to Romans chapter 1, please, because the marvels of the natural world are not just there for our pleasure, though they give us pleasure, don't they? But God has placed the marvels of creation in perspective that man might be challenged by that, by its beauty, its intricacy, its wonder. Now I'm going to read from verse 19, Romans chapter 1, verse 19, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it to them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. I have there the ESV translation on the screen. For what can be known about God is plain, because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So the design that we see, the beauty that we see, the enjoyment that we see has a purpose. God is confronting mankind with all of this intricacy and saying, this screams a creator. This screams power. This screams majesty. You only have to look at the stars themselves to see the glory of those things. And God says, I put them like that so that man is without excuse. See, and this is where evolution really does such damaging work, because it removes man from a responsibility of having to obey a creator. Secondly, the marvels of the created world, the intricacy has been presented so that men and women can humbly recognize their true position in life and be thankful. Look at Psalm 8. Let's come across to the 8th Psalm. Creation is designed to challenge men's thinking, to get them to think. So here we are in Psalm 8, verse 3. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou didst visitest him? But when you look at the glorious power displayed in creation, the magnificence of the stars, it should humble us. Who are we that God has stooped, if you like, to give us a glorious and wonderful purpose in life? Psalm 19, just a few pages over. Verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. The heavens declare the glory of God, his handiwork. And in fact, with the James Webb Telescope, as we're seeing further and further into the depths of space, and man is being impressed with the magnitude of the galaxies and beyond, it should in fact give us a sense of unworthiness, a sense of being honor to God who's done all those things, to keep these things moving with his power and his majesty. And in the same psalm, we have in verse 7, the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The God who made the heavens, made the earth, made the intricacy and beauty of nature, has given us his word. And that word is able to convert and to make wise. You know, when a child is born, the magnificence of that, I think, hits every parent for the first time, doesn't it? When they see this perfectly formed child, which they have reproduced, and the psalmist says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. The intricacy of the human body, the way the information is connected together in all those elements, is indeed an amazing and startling sense of genius. Fearfully and wonderfully made. So the alternative, I think, makes much more sense. But we have to have the humility to be able to accept the fact that there is a creator, and that creator seeks from us obedience and a response to his love. In summary, he's given us his word, and Jesus said, thy word is truth. And we as Christadelphians believe that if we read this prayerfully and carefully, it will yield its secrets. It is a consistent, powerful book that's able to challenge us and change us and transform us if we are prepared to put the time in to read it and to understand it. And we're here to answer any questions that you might have in relation to that. The Bible declares that God created all things, as complete functioning units. God made man in his own image after his own likeness. We have not descended from microbes. We have no affinity to apes. We have been created in the image of God. We have been given a potential and capacity to be able to understand what he has revealed through his word. There is no leap species to species. Yes, there are changes and variations within the species. Different sized beaks, different color eyes, different color skin, feathers, but they're still birds, they're still animals. And as far as God is concerned, he created all things after their kind, and they stay within that kind. And the Bible asks us not just to appreciate creation, but to be able to appreciate the wisdom behind that. And a God who can so wisely create things can so wisely help us to understand him and to offer us some incredible promises. Now, we speak about these promises from this particular platform from time to time. But if God is wise to give us the abundance and variety of creation, he's also wise to give us amazing promises. And this is our final slide, because you see, evolution offers no hope at all beyond the grave. None whatsoever. None whatsoever. Imagine the futility of following a theory all your life to find that when you're dead, that's it. But the Bible, on the other hand, God's purpose, on the other hand, offers everlasting life. To conclude, I'd like you to come to Mark chapter 16. This just summarizes the requirements that God has. And we have seminars on this subject to expand this more carefully. But this is very simple. Mark chapter 16, the words of Jesus Christ himself to his disciples. In verse 15, he said to his disciples, "Go you into all the world. Preach the gospel to every creature. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be damned or condemned." So we really need to understand what the gospel is. We need not only to understand it, but to believe it. And after we've believed it and appreciate what has been said, then we are going to subject ourselves to baptism. And if we can do those things and live a life of obedience, we'll be saved. The God who so wisely created everything has so wisely and mercifully given us a hope of everlasting life, something which evolution is absolutely incapable of doing.